The cold hum of cell block C was a constant, low-frequency thrum that vibrated through the concrete, a physical manifestation of the despair and simmering rage it contained. It was a sound Elias knew intimately, a soundtrack to his forced retirement. Today, however, an undercurrent of something else, a predatory anticipation, had joined the usual drone. He felt it in the subtle shift of the air, the way the guards moved with a slightly more rigid posture, the hushed whispers that snaked through the grimy common room. He sat on his bunk, meticulously cleaning his glasses with a corner of his threadbare shirt. The lenses, though old and scratched, offered him a clear view of the cell door, and beyond it, the parade of the damned. He wasn't looking for trouble, but he wasn't avoiding it either. Not anymore. He'd done his time blending in, being the old man, the one who kept to himself. But even a shadow casts a ripple eventually. The ripple in question was a man named Brick. He wasn't particularly bright, but he possessed a brutal simplicity that made him effective in this environment. Brick had been circling Elias for days, a shark scenting blood in the water. Elias was an easy mark, old, quiet, with no visible crew. Brick saw vulnerability, a chance to solidify his own shaky dominance by taking a piece of the old man's meager commissary, or, worse, his dignity. The door clanged open, signaling the end of recreation. Elias rose slowly, his joints protesting with a familiar creak. Brick was waiting. He leaned against the steel frame of Elias's cell, a mountain of muscle and tattooed aggression. His eyes, small and cold, raked over Elias's slight frame. "Well, well, if it ain't Grandpa," Brick sneered, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Heard you been holding out on me, old man." Elias met his gaze. His own eyes, though clouded with age, held a surprising depth. "I have nothing for you, Brick," he said, his voice a quiet rasp. A low growl emanated from Brick's chest. He stepped into the cell, filling the cramped space with his bulk. The air grew heavy, thick with menace. "Don't play dumb, old man. Everyone knows you got something. Maybe that's why you're so quiet. Got secrets, huh?" Elias remained still, a statue carved from weary stone. He'd faced worse men in worse places. This was just another Tuesday. "My silence is not a commodity, Brick, nor is it an invitation." Brick scoffed, a wet guttural sound. He took another step, invading Elias's personal space. The stench of stale sweat and cheap cologne filled Elias's nostrils. "I ain't asking. I'm telling you. You're gonna hand over whatever you got, or I'm gonna make you wish you never saw the light of day." A flicker of something, not fear, but a weary assessment, crossed Elias's face. He'd seen this dance countless times. The bluster, the intimidation, leading to the inevitable moment of truth. He wondered briefly if he was too old for this. Then he remembered the countless faces of those he'd protected, the lives he'd saved. He wasn't too old. He was experienced. "You won't like what you find, Brick," Elias warned, his voice still low, but with an edge that was barely perceptible. Brick laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. He reached out, his massive hand closing around Elias's shoulder, squeezing with bruising force. "Oh, I think I will. I think I'll like it very much." He began to push, intending to shove Elias against the wall. This was the trigger. Elias's movements were fluid, economical, a testament to decades of ingrained muscle memory. He didn't resist the shove, but rather yielded to it, turning his body with the momentum. This seemingly passive move threw Brick off balance for a crucial fraction of a second. As Brick stumbled forward, Elias's left hand, surprisingly fast, shot out. It didn't strike, but rather hooked around Brick's outstretched arm, a leverage point. Simultaneously, his right hand, a blur of motion, found the pressure point just beneath Brick's ear. It wasn't a punch, but a precise, controlled strike, a sharp rap of his knuckles against the nerve cluster. The effect was instantaneous and debilitating. Brick's eyes widened in shock, and his massive body stiffening. The pressure point, a technique Elias had learned from an ancient master in the Hindu Kush, sent a blinding flash of pain through Brick's skull, momentarily paralyzing his motor functions. His hand released Elias's shoulder, his arm going limp. Elias, still moving with the grace of a much younger man, didn't stop there. He used Brick's own weight against him. With a practiced twist of his left hand, he redirected Brick's momentum, pulling him forward and down. He didn't need brute strength. He needed precision. His knee, a surprisingly agile weapon, came up swiftly, not for a bone-shattering blow, but for another pressure point, this one in the back of Brick's thigh. Brick let out a choked gasp, his legs giving out beneath him. He crashed to the concrete floor, a bewildered heap of muscle and misplaced aggression. The impact rattled the flimsy cot in the cell next door. The usual sounds of the cell block, the distant shouts, the clanging of metal, seemed to momentarily cease, replaced by a stunned silence. Elias stood over him, breathing deeply, his chest barely rising and falling. His movements had been so quick, so efficient, that it was over before anyone outside the cell could fully register what had happened. He looked down at the sprawling figure of Brick, whose face was contorted in a mixture of pain and disbelief. "I told you," Elias said, his voice calm, almost conversational. "You wouldn't like what you found." He bent down, not to inflict more harm, but to retrieve a small, intricately carved wooden bird that had fallen from his pocket during the brief altercation. He brushed off the dust, his movements unhurried. Brick, still reeling, managed to push himself up onto his elbows, his eyes blazing with a humiliated fury. He tried to speak, but only a gurgle escaped his throat. He understood then. The old man wasn't just an old man. He was something else entirely. The silence in cell block C began to break, a nervous murmur rippling through the corridors. Other inmates, drawn by the sudden quiet and then the thud, peered out of their cells, their faces a mixture of curiosity and dawning comprehension. They saw Elias, composed and unruffled, and Brick, a large, intimidating figure, now a crumpled mess on the floor. The message was clear. Elias straightened up, the wooden bird clutched in his hand. He glanced at the open cell door, then back at Brick. "Consider this a lesson," he said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by the now gathering crowd of onlookers. "Some prey, Brick, have very sharp teeth." He stepped over Brick's groaning form, walked out of his cell, and calmly joined the stream of inmates heading for the mess hall. The cold hum of cell block C now carrying a new, unspoken respect. Silas, the quiet man. The clatter of trays and the low murmur of conversation in the mess hall were a predictable symphony, a dull hum against the clang of steel doors. Silas, an enigma to most, sat alone at his usual table in the corner, his gaze fixed on a chipped enamel plate. His meal, a watery stew and a wedge of coarse bread, remained untouched. He wasn't a man for hearty appetites or boisterous company. Word of Elias's swift, almost surgical dismantling of Brick had spread like wildfire. It had been the topic of hushed whispers and astonished glances. Silas, though present, hadn't uttered a word, his expression as unreadable as ever. Yet, something in the way his eyes tracked Elias when the old man entered the mess hall suggested a deeper understanding, a recognition of something beyond mere luck. Today, Elias chose a table closer to the center, a small concession to his newfound standing. No one dared to approach him, but several pairs of eyes watched his every move. Silas, however, continued to stare at his plate, seemingly oblivious. A guard, a burly man named Jenkins, with a perpetually sour expression, strode past Silas's table, his boots scuffing the concrete. He paused, a sneer twisting his lips. "Still pushing that food around, Silas. You're gonna waste away to nothing." Silas didn't flinch, didn't even look up. He slowly picked up his spoon, then just as slowly set it back down. Jenkins scoffed, moving on. The incident was typical. Silas rarely engaged, rarely even acknowledged the guards beyond a perfunctory nod during roll call. It was this quiet detachment that set him apart, even in a place teeming with withdrawn souls. Later that afternoon, during yard time, the usual cacophony of shouts and shuffling feet filled the enclosed space. Elias, for the first time, was not immediately surrounded by the curious or the cautious. Instead, a path seemed to clear around him, a respectful distance maintained. He walked to the edge of the yard, near the worn-out basketball hoop, and began a series of slow, deliberate stretches. His movements, though fluid, betrayed the stiffness of age. Silas, meanwhile, was at the far end of the yard, leaning against the cold concrete wall, his eyes scanning the horizon of razor wire. He wore a threadbare jacket, despite the mild air, his hands tucked into his pockets. He was a shadow, a presence easily overlooked. As Elias finished his stretches, he glanced over, his gaze meeting Silas's across the expanse of concrete. There was no challenge, no overt curiosity, just a lingering look. Silas offered an almost imperceptible nod, a slight dip of his chin. Elias responded in kind, a flicker of something akin to acknowledgement in his ancient eyes. It was a silent conversation, understood only by the two men who had seen too much. The next day, during library hours, a rare privilege, Silas was found in his usual spot, hunched over a tattered book on ancient languages. Elias, who had a surprising affinity for philosophy, sat a few tables away. The library was a quiet refuge, the air thick with the scent of old paper and dust. Suddenly, a loud clang echoed from the far end of the room. A stack of books had toppled, scattering across the floor. Everyone looked up, startled. It was Brick, his face still a roadmap of bruises, a smirk playing on his lips. He had deliberately bumped the shelf, an act of petty disruption. "Oops," he drawled, his voice grating. He made no move to pick up the books. A few inmates shifted uncomfortably, but no one challenged him. Brick's reputation for aggression, though recently dented, still held sway. Elias sighed, a sound barely audible, and slowly began to rise. But before he could take a step, Silas, who had been a silent fixture in the corner, moved. He didn't rush, didn't make a scene. He simply walked over to the scattered books, his movements unhurried, almost languid. Brick watched him, his smirk faltering. Silas knelt, his joints creaking softly, and began to meticulously stack the books. He didn't look at Brick, didn't acknowledge his presence. He simply restored order. Brick, clearly expecting a reaction, a challenge, anything to fuel his aggression, found himself deflated. He stood there for a moment, his eyes darting between Silas and Elias. Then finally, with a frustrated huff, he turned and stomped out of the library. Silas finished stacking the books, his movements precise, almost ritualistic. He stood, dusting off his hands, then turned and walked back to his table. He picked up his book, his gaze falling once more on the intricate script. He hadn't said a word, hadn't made a sound beyond the soft rustle of paper. Yet, in that quiet act, he had asserted a different kind of strength, a quiet resilience that resonated deeply with Elias. The old man watched him, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. Silas was an enigma, but an enigma Elias was beginning to understand. The bully's gaze. The mess hall pulsed with a cacophony of scraping trays and guttural shouts, a rhythmic clangor Elias knew intimately. He prodded his meager rations, the phantom ache of his recent victory over Brick, a dull throb. That triumph felt hollow now, a fleeting respite in a world perpetually at war with itself. Across the room, Silas sat apart, an isle of quiet contemplation amidst the prisoner's churning sea. His distant gaze seemed to fathom a truth beyond their squalid existence. A sudden hush rippled through the din, an unsettling wave originating from the far end of the hall. Elias looked up. Brick, a mountainous silhouette, lumbered toward Old Man Tiber. Tiber, known for his gentle spirit and the intricate carvings he coaxed from discarded wood, was a constant presence, a fragile sapling in a forest of gnarled oaks. He hunched over his tray, seemingly oblivious to the approaching storm. Brick halted, his shadow consuming the old man. "Well, well, if it isn't the old bird." Brick sneered, his voice a low thrum that surprisingly cut through the sudden silence. "Lost your teeth yet, Grandpa?" A few nervous snickers flickered, quickly extinguished by Brick's intimidating glare. Elias felt a familiar knot tighten. He'd witnessed this ritual countless times. Brick sought to reclaim his lost authority, and Tiber, with his undeniable vulnerability, presented an easy target. Tiber slowly lifted his head. His eyes, though age-clouded, held a startling depth. He neither flinched nor cowered, simply met Brick's gaze. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through his gnarled hands. "Is there something I can help you with, son?" Tiber's voice, soft and raspy, carried an unexpected, unwavering authority. Brick's sneer widened, revealing a missing tooth. "You can get out of my sight, old man. This table's too good for the likes of you." With a ham-sized hand, he gestured, knocking Tiber's tray. A meager portion of gruel sloshed over the side. A collective gasp swept the hall. Even the most hardened inmates understood the unspoken sanctity of food. This was a deliberate humiliation. Elias watched, muscles coiling. He felt the familiar surge of anger, the primal urge to intervene. Yet the cold hand of self-preservation stayed him. He'd just bested Brick. Another confrontation, especially for someone else, could be disastrous. He glanced at Silas, who remained still, his gaze fixed on Tiber, an unreadable tableau. Tiber, however, defied expectation. He calmly wiped the spilled gruel with a piece of stale bread, his movements slow, deliberate. "There's enough room for everyone, young man," he stated, his voice retaining its quiet dignity. "And this table has served me well for many years." Brick's face darkened. He was unaccustomed to defiance, especially from someone he deemed beneath, contempt. "You think you're tough, old-timer?" he snarled, leaning closer, his breath hot and foul. "Let me show you tough." He reached out, thick fingers closing around the collar of Tiber's threadbare shirt. Just as Brick prepared to yank Tiber from his seat, a blur of motion erupted from the periphery. Not Elias, not even Silas. It was Flicker, a wiry man, a shadowy presence in the prison for years. Flicker moved with unexpected agility, slamming his own tray down with a clang that resonated like a gunshot. "Leave him be, Brick!" Flicker's voice, usually a whisper, was surprisingly firm. His eyes, typically darting and nervous, now pierced Brick with an unyielding intensity. Brick, caught off guard, hesitated. Flicker wasn't a fighter, but his sudden, uncharacteristic outburst had fractured the power dynamic. The other inmates, sensing a shift, held their breath. Brick slowly released Tiber's collar, his gaze flickering between Flicker and the old man. The moment stretched, taut and silent. Then, with a frustrated grunt, Brick turned, stomping away, his bravado deflating with each heavy step. He knew he'd been publicly challenged, and more importantly, publicly checked. Not by a rival, but by an insignificant member of the prison hierarchy. A collective sigh of relief washed through the mess hall. Tiber, his composure unbroken, offered Flicker a small, grateful nod. Flicker, in turn, gave a curt nod back, then melted into the shadows, his moment of courage seemingly spent. Elias watched the exchange, a new understanding dawning. It wasn't always about brute force. Sometimes it was a quiet defiance, an unexpected stand, a ripple of courage that could disrupt even the most entrenched power. He looked at Silas again. The older man now ate his meal slowly, his eyes still holding that distant, knowing quality. Elias wondered what Silas had seen, what deeper currents he had observed in the brief, tense confrontation. He knew then that the prison was not merely walls and bars, but a complex ecosystem of unspoken rules, alliances, and surprising acts of humanity. And he, Elias, was still learning its intricate, often brutal language. Small pokes and steady eyes. The image of Flicker, small and trembling, yet utterly defiant, was burned into Elias's mind. It shattered the comfortable, if bleak, understanding he'd formed of this place. Power wasn't just brute force, he realized, watching Brick's swagger return a day later as he bullied a younger inmate over a meager ration. There were subtler currents, unseen pressures, and unexpected sources of strength. He found Tiber that evening, hunched over a worn deck of cards, meticulously arranging them in patterns Elias couldn't decipher. The old man's face, usually a map of tired resignation, held a glint of something akin to pride. "You saw it, didn't you, boy?" Tiber murmured, not looking up. His voice was raspy, like dry leaves skittering across stone. Elias nodded, settling onto the cold floor beside him. "I did. Brick, he just walked away." Tiber chuckled, a dry, wheezing sound. "Aye, didn't expect that, did he? Thought I was just a broken old twig." He finally met Elias's gaze, his eyes surprisingly sharp. "Flicker, he's a good lad. Got a fire in him, even if it's just a flicker." "He was terrified," Elias observed. "That's what makes it courage, boy. Doing what needs to be done even when your bones are rattling." Tiber paused, his gaze drifting to the grimy ceiling. "Reminds me of a story. Long ago, in a place far from here, a bully, much like Brick, thought he had the world by the throat. But he overlooked the small pokes, the steady eyes." Elias leaned in, intrigued. "What happened?" Tiber smiled, a rare, genuine expression. He learned that even a small stone can bring down a giant, if aimed true. It's not about size or even strength. It's about knowing where to strike, and having the guts to do it. He tapped a gnarled finger on a card. "And sometimes, just sometimes, it's about making them think you know something they don't." The next few days were a blur of observation for Elias. He watched Brick, noting his predictable routines, his flashes of temper, the subtle ways he used fear to maintain control. He saw the way other inmates averted their eyes, the quick, almost imperceptible shifts in their posture when Brick passed. He also watched Flicker, who, despite his earlier bravery, seemed to shrink back into himself, moving like a shadow. One afternoon, during the brief yard period, Elias noticed Brick cornering Flicker near the rusting water pump. Brick's voice, usually a booming declaration, was a low growl, menacing even from a distance. Elias felt a familiar surge of anger, a desire to intervene, but Tiber's words echoed in his mind. Small pokes, steady eyes. He approached slowly, not directly towards them, but towards the edge of the yard, feigning interest in a cracked patch of concrete. He kept Brick in his peripheral vision. He saw Flicker flinch, his shoulders hunched. Then, Elias did something subtle. He caught the eye of a burly inmate named Kale, a quiet man who usually kept to himself, but had a reputation for fairness. Elias didn't speak, didn't gesture. He just held Kale's gaze for a beat longer than necessary, a silent acknowledgement of what was happening. Kale, sensing the unspoken plea, shifted his weight. He didn't charge in, didn't shout. Instead, he simply walked past Brick and Flicker, close enough that Brick had to pause his harangue to avoid a collision. As Kale passed, he coughed loudly, a dry, deliberate sound that drew the attention of several other inmates. Brick, momentarily distracted by the sudden shift in focus, looked up. He saw Kale, then he saw Elias, whose gaze was now fixed on him, steady and unwavering. It wasn't a challenge, not overtly. It was simply presence. Brick hesitated. The raw, unchallenged dominance of his previous encounters with Flicker was gone. The audience had changed. With a disgusted grunt, Brick shoved Flicker, but without the usual force, and stalked away. Flicker stumbled, catching himself, then looked up, his eyes wide with surprise and a dawning understanding. He glanced at Kale, who merely shrugged, then at Elias, who offered a subtle nod. Later, Tiber found Elias sitting alone, carving a small, intricate bird out of a piece of scavenged wood. "You learned something today, didn't you, boy?" Tiber asked, his voice softer than usual. Elias looked at the tiny bird in his hands. "I think so. It's not just about fighting the monster head-on." Tiber smiled, a knowing glint in his eyes. "Indeed. Sometimes it's about making the monster realize he's not the only one in the room. And sometimes the most effective weapon is simply seeing clearly and letting others see too." He paused, his gaze thoughtful. "This place, it tries to break you, to make you believe you're alone. But even in the darkest corners, there are threads, connections, and sometimes all it takes is a small poke and a steady eye to remind everyone of that." Elias looked from the small wooden bird to the old man's weathered face. He still had so much to learn, so much to understand about the hidden currents of power and courage. But for the first time since he'd arrived, he felt a flicker of something beyond despair. He felt a plan forming. Warden's watch. The rhythmic clank of guard boots echoed through the corridor, a grating accompaniment to their confinement. Elias leaned against the rough concrete, the damp chill seeping through his thin uniform. The air, thick with stale sweat and antiseptic, embodied the insidious erosion of hope. Across the common room, Flicker hunched over a worn paperback, his shoulders taut despite the momentary respite from Brick's intimidation. Elias's intervention had provided a temporary truce, a minor skirmish in an ongoing war. Silas, ever the enigma, occupied a bench near the barred windows, his gaze fixed on the sliver of gray sky. He observed, processed, a silent sentinel in their grim world. Their eyes met, a flash of shared understanding. The old man, like Elias, understood that true power here stemmed not from brute force but from pervasive influence. Later, after stale rations and clanging cell doors, Elias grappled with the implications of his actions. Protecting Flicker had come at a cost. He'd drawn unwanted attention, making himself a target for those who thrived on dominance. Yet, a new resolve began to harden within him. The fear that had once shackled him yielded to calculated determination. He thought of Flicker's quiet courage, Tiber's subtle wisdom, and a new understanding coalesced. This place transcended mere survival. It was about rewriting the narrative, upending unspoken rules. The next morning, a subtle current of change was palpable. Brick's predatory glances, though present, now held a shade of uncertainty when they fell on Flicker. The ripple effect of Elias's intervention, almost imperceptible to the casual observer, felt seismic to him. He noticed how the quieter inmates, usually withdrawn, now met his gaze with brief, acknowledging nods. He hadn't just protected Flicker. He'd inadvertently lent a voice, however faint, to the silent majority. During yard time, Elias sought out Tiber, who, as usual, observed a makeshift handball game. "Tiber," Elias began, his voice low, "the brick situation, it's not over." Tiber nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the frantic play. "No, but you've planted a seed. Now, we cultivate it." He turned to Elias, his gaze sharp and knowing. "The warden sees everything. He cares less about our petty squabbles than about order. When that order is disturbed, he acts. Sometimes that action can be manipulated." Elias considered this. He'd always viewed the warden as an omnipotent, unfeeling force, an unassailable authority. But Tiber's words hinted at a more nuanced system, one susceptible to subtle influence. "How do we manipulate the warden?" Elias asked, a nascent strategy forming. Tiber finally looked away from the game, his expression unreadable. "The warden values information, control, a quiet block. If disruption serves his purpose, he allows it. If not, he crushes it. The trick is to make your order his order." The idea resonated. Elias wasn't aiming for violent overthrow, but strategic realignment. He needed to make the existing power structure work for them. He began to observe the guards more closely, noting their routines, their habits, the subtle ways they communicated with each other and, crucially, with the warden. He saw the quick, furtive glances exchanged when a fight erupted, the shift in their posture when reporting to superiors. The warden might be a distant figure, but his eyes and ears were omnipresent. One afternoon, Elias noticed Guard Miller meticulously documenting a minor infraction by one of Brick's associates. Miller was known for his rigid adherence to protocol. Elias saw an opportunity. He watched as Miller's pen scratched loudly in the otherwise quiet common room. Elias allowed himself to be seen, not overtly, but as a quiet, observant presence. He wanted Miller to register him, not as a troublemaker, but as someone who also valued order, albeit a different kind. The prison air, usually stagnant with unspoken grievances, now hummed with a different energy. Elias felt it, a faint but growing current of awareness. He was no longer just surviving. He was observing, planning, and subtly, almost imperceptibly, shifting the balance. The warden watched, yes, but perhaps, just perhaps, Elias could make him see what he wanted him to see. The next move wouldn't be a punch or a shout. It would be an engineered whisper, a carefully placed ripple in the warden's carefully maintained calm. The laundry room trap. The oppressive humidity of the laundry room clung to Elias like a second skin, thick with the scent of industrial detergent and stale sweat. The rhythmic thud of dryers echoed off the stained concrete walls, a monotonous soundtrack to the forced labor. He watched, a silent observer, as the guards conducted their usual rounds, their boots scuffing the grimy floor. Their routines were predictable, almost ritualistic, a series of practiced motions that spoke of ingrained habit rather than genuine vigilance. Elias folded a surprisingly soft sheet, his movements fluid and unhurried. He cataloged their conversation snippets, their posture shifts, the way their eyes darted, or failed to dart, into shadowed corners. He noticed Guard Miller, the one with the perpetually bored expression, spent more time adjusting his belt than surveying the inmates. Guard Davies, a burly man whose bulk seemed to absorb sound, had a tell, a slight tilt of his head when he was genuinely listening. Otherwise, his gaze was vacant. Elias committed these details to memory, each observation a thread in the intricate tapestry he was weaving. "You look like you're planning a hostile takeover of the linen closet," Silas drawled, leaning against a towering stack of freshly laundered uniforms. His voice, a low rumble, cut through the laundry room's din. Elias offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile, just appreciating the finer points of institutional efficiency. He gestured subtly towards Miller, who was currently engrossed in a whispered conversation with another guard, their backs to a blind spot near the industrial presses. "They're remarkably consistent," Silas grunted, a sound that could mean anything from agreement to amusement. "Consistency breeds complacency, and complacency, in here, is a slow poison." He picked at a loose thread on a uniform, his eyes, sharp and knowing, fixed on Elias. "You've got a glint in your eye, Elias, the kind that usually precedes a headache for someone else." "I'm merely cultivating an understanding of the system, Silas. As Tiber suggested, to make my order, the warden's order, I must first understand the warden's order." Elias picked up a heavy laundry bag, the canvas rough against his calloused hands. Silas pushed off the stack. "So, you're looking for the weak links, the cracks in the facade. Every system has them, even one as seemingly impenetrable as this," Elias confirmed, his voice barely above a whisper. He moved towards the back of the room, near the oversized washing machines, where the hum was loudest, effectively masking their conversation. "The guards, for all their posturing, are creatures of habit. They fear the warden, yes, but they also fear anything that disrupts their comfortable monotony." His gaze landed on a specific spot, a heavy-duty laundry cart, usually left unattended in a dimly lit corner. It was a metal behemoth, capable of holding a considerable load, and, more importantly, blocking the line of sight from certain vantage points. "What's the play?" Silas asked, his tone laced with a familiar curiosity. He'd seen Elias's mind at work before, witnessed the subtle shifts that heralded a strategic move. "Not a play, yet. An observation," Elias corrected. "But consider this. What happens if their routine is inconvenienced? What if a minor disruption, carefully orchestrated, causes a ripple effect they can't control?" Silas's lips twitched. "You're thinking of a domino effect. One small push, and everything else tumbles." "Precisely. And the laundry room, Silas, is a perfect stage. High traffic, low supervision, and the constant din provides excellent cover." Elias paused, letting his words sink in. "It's about making them feel the need for order, rather than having it imposed. About showing them that their negligence has consequences. Not just for us, but for them." The metallic clang of a dropped laundry basket echoed, drawing the attention of Guard Miller, who finally looked up from his conversation, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. Elias met his gaze, offering a blank, unreadable expression before returning to his folding. The seed had been planted. He had merely pointed out a potential vulnerability. The next step would be to exploit it. The air in the laundry room seemed to thicken, charged with an unspoken anticipation. The stage was set, and Elias, with his quiet intensity, was ready to begin his performance. The push and the blur. The clatter of metal laundry bins echoed through the cavernous room, a rhythmic counterpoint to the hiss of the industrial dryers. Elias, lost in the monotonous fold of rough-spun sheets, felt the familiar prickle of anticipation. His hands moved with unpracticed efficiency, each crease a tiny act of rebellion against the crushing weight of boredom. He'd chosen today, the day a new batch of guards rotated in, their faces still holding a faint trace of civilian softness. They hadn't yet learned the rhythm of the prison, the subtle cues of simmering discontent that seasoned officers read like an open book. "You still think this is going to work, Elias?" Silas's voice was a low rumble beside him, barely audible over the machinery. He stacked a pile of towels with an unnerving precision, his eyes darting towards the guard station. Officer Miller, a fresh-faced recruit, was engrossed in a paperback, his boots propped casually on the desk. Elias didn't look up. "It doesn't need to work perfectly, Silas. It just needs to disrupt." He thought of the small, carefully placed snag in the dryer vent, a tiny obstruction that would, at just the right moment, escalate into a minor crisis. He'd timed it for the mid-afternoon lull, when vigilance was at its lowest. He felt the shift before he saw it. A faint smell, acrid and metallic, began to permeate the air. It was subtle at first, masked by the pervasive scent of industrial detergent. Then, a low whine from one of the massive dryers intensified, growing into a grating groan. Miller, still lost in his book, didn't stir. Elias caught Silas's eye, a flicker of understanding passing between them. A sudden, sharp pop, like a firecracker, ripped through the room. The groan became a violent shudder. Elias glanced over, a controlled urgency in his movements. The dryer, a behemoth designated Unit 7, began to spew a thin plume of smoke from its ventilation shaft. Other inmates, initially oblivious, started to notice. Whispers rippled through the room. Miller finally looked up, his brow furrowed in confusion. He sniffed the air, his eyes scanning the room. "What's that smell?" he mumbled, more to himself than anyone. "Looks like Unit 7 is acting up, officer," Elias called out, his voice calm, just loud enough to be heard over the rising clamor. He pointed with a folded sheet. Miller's eyes widened slightly as he saw the smoke. He snatched up a walkie-talkie, his movements clumsy. We've got a situation in the laundry room. Unit 7, smoking." His voice cracked slightly. The situation escalated quickly. The smoke thickened, acrid and stinging. The dryer's internal mechanisms began to shriek, a sound like tortured metal. Panic, a low hum at first, began to build. Inmates started backing away from Unit 7, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and irritation. "Everyone, stay calm," Miller yelled, but his voice was drowned out by the rising noise. He fumbled with the fire extinguisher on the wall, struggling to release it from its bracket. The other two guards, equally green, stood frozen, their eyes wide. Elias saw his opening. He moved decisively, not towards the chaos, but away from it, towards the narrow service corridor that led to the utility room. "Silas, the main power switch," he murmured, just loud enough for his companion. Silas, without a word, veered off, a shadow melting into the periphery. Miller, finally wrestling the extinguisher free, aimed it vaguely at the smoking dryer. A cloud of chemical foam erupted, coating the machine and adding to the already stifling air. The shriek of the dryer intensified, a guttural roar. Suddenly, the lights flickered, then died, plunging the laundry room into a murky twilight. Only emergency lights casting long, distorted shadows provided illumination. A collective gasp rose from the inmates, quickly followed by shouts of alarm. The machine's roar, however, continued, an infernal beast in the gloom. Elias, now in the dimness of the service corridor, moved with practiced ease. He reached a corroded pipe, its surface slick with condensation. He pressed his palm against it, feeling for the faint vibration he knew would be there. Then, a subtle shift in the air, a drop in pressure. The dryer's roar finally sputtered, coughed, and died. Silence, thick and unsettling, descended upon the laundry room. Only the distant wail of alarms, now activated, broke the quiet. The smoke, no longer being forcefully expelled, began to dissipate, leaving behind a lingering acrid tang. Elias emerged from the corridor, his face impassive. The guards, illuminated by the emergency lights, looked like statues of bewildered panic. Miller stood amidst a cloud of fire extinguisher foam, his uniform now splattered, the walkie-talkie still clutched in his hand. "What in God's name just happened?" one of the other guards stammered, his voice trembling. Elias cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "Looks like the main dryer shorted out, officers. Probably overworked, and the power went with it." He gestured vaguely towards the ceiling. "Good thing those old pipes are still working, though." Silas reappeared from the shadows, his presence as quiet as his departure. He gave Elias a barely perceptible nod. The small, carefully placed obstruction in the dryer vent, designed to create overheating, and the even more subtle tampering with a specific valve in the utility room, timed to coincide with the smoke and cause a temporary pressure drop, had worked perfectly. The resulting surge, coupled with the old wiring, had tripped the main circuit. A minor incident, yes, but enough to rattle the complacent guards, expose their lack of preparedness, and force a reevaluation of their security protocols. The wail of more sirens grew louder, closer. Reinforcements were on their way. The disruption had been achieved. Elias looked at the disoriented guards, then at the gathered inmates, their faces now a mix of bewilderment and a growing, almost imperceptible, sense of shared experience. He knew this was just the first ripple. The true impact would come later, when the prison's power structure, shaken by this seemingly random event, would have to reassert its control. And in that reassertion, Elias intended to find a weakness to exploit. He met Silas's gaze again. The message was clear. Phase 1 complete. Now we wait for the blur. The masterclass. The morning clang of meal trays brought little relief to Elias's unusual disquiet. He'd braced himself for the fallout from his laundry room gambit, the escalating tension, the hushed conjecture. But the warden's unsettling silence was a curveball. He needed to gauge the precise extent of the upheaval he'd orchestrated. As he scraped rubbery eggs from his plate, a new face materialized at his cell door. A guard whose fresh-faced earnestness practically radiated first-week jitters. The newcomer, Peterson, fumbled with the latch, his gaze skittering nervously around the block. "Morning, Peterson," Elias offered, his tone calm, almost cordial. Peterson jumped, startled, then manufactured a smile. "Morning, sir. Is everything in order here?" "As in order as it ever gets," Elias replied, a subtle ironic lilt in his voice. He observed Peterson's rigid posture and jerky movements, classic tells of anxiety. "Heard there was a bit of a kerfuffle in the laundry yesterday." New recruits, eh? Always a learning curve. Peterson's eyes widened, then narrowed almost immediately, as if recalling some protocol. Nothing to worry about, sir. Just a minor equipment malfunction. Right, and the power outage? Elias probed gently. Routine maintenance, Peterson mumbled, averting his gaze. The lie was flimsy, transparent. Elias understood then. The warden was scrambling to control the narrative, to minimize the incident. His initial gambit had succeeded beyond expectation. The seed of doubt was firmly planted. Later, during yard time, an unfamiliar tension permeated the air. The usual boisterous clamor of shouts and jeers had been replaced by hushed conversations and cautious glances. Elias found Silas by the makeshift weight pile, his powerful frame straining against a rusty barbell. Phase 1 was a triumph, Elias murmured, pausing to wipe sweat from his brow. They're trying to muzzle it, which means they're rattled, but it also means they'll be searching for a scapegoat. Silas grunted, lowering the weight with a controlled exhale. Think they'll pin it on a new guy? Perhaps, or they'll find a conveniently available troublemaker to blame. But that's not our immediate concern. Our concern is the next move. Elias's gaze swept across the yard, noting the subtle shifts in inmate dynamics. The block bosses, those usual predators, still strutted with their customary arrogance, yet their swagger felt slightly deflated, their pronouncements less absolute. He spotted Flicker, huddled by the wall, even more withdrawn than usual. The previous day's chaos visibly etched onto his demeanor. The true test arrived an hour later. Elias sat alone, absorbed in a dog-eared paperback, by the prison library's single barred window, when the unmistakable thud of heavy footsteps approached. A shadow fell across his page. He looked up to see the Brute, a colossal figure from cell block D, infamous for his volatile temper and his habit of preying on the weak. The Brute had been circling Flicker for days, a slow, predatory hunt. Elias had anticipated this. Lost your way, Brute? Elias inquired, his voice level, betraying no hint of the adrenaline now surging through him. The Brute sneered, his eyes narrowed to tiny slits of malice. Heard you're the new top dog, Elias. Protecting little birds, are we? He motioned with his chin towards Flicker, who was now visibly trembling, attempting to shrink into the wall. Flicker's under my protection, Elias stated, closing his book and placing it deliberately beside him. His movements were unhurried. Got a problem with that? The Brute let out a guttural laugh, a sound that scraped against the nerves. Protection? From you? You're an old man, Elias, and a scrawny one, at that. He advanced, his bulk casting a menacing shadow. Guess I'll have to teach you how things are done around here. Elias rose slowly, his posture relaxed, almost nonchalant. You can try, he said, a faint smile playing on his lips. The Brute lunged, a predictable, powerful swing aimed at Elias's head, but Elias was already in motion, a blur of controlled energy. He ducked beneath the wild haymaker, his hand darting out to seize the Brute's wrist. A sharp twist, a sudden pivot, and the Brute found himself off balance, his own momentum betraying him. Elias wielded the Brute's weight against him, a testament to leverage, not brute force. He didn't strike the Brute. Instead, he spun him, shoving him hard towards the wall. The Brute stumbled, recovering quickly, but the initial surprise had rattled him. He charged again, a roar tearing from his throat. This time, Elias met him head-on, but not with a punch. He sidestepped at the last instant, driving his shoulder into the Brute's midsection with surprising force, then used his elbow to strike a nerve cluster in the Brute's neck. The giant reeled, his eyes glazing over, momentarily disoriented. Elias wasn't fighting for a brawl's victory. He was delivering a lesson. not aiming for knockouts, but for domination. He moved with almost surgical precision, parrying blows, redirecting force, subtly manipulating the brute's equilibrium. Each movement was economic, designed to expose a vulnerability, to exploit an opening. He unleashed a series of rapid, precise jabs to the brute's diaphragm, quick, stinging blows that stole the air from his lungs. The brute gasped, his rage giving way to confusion, then a dawning fear. Finally, with a perfectly timed foot sweep, Elias brought the lumbering giant crashing to the ground, a loud thud echoing through the suddenly silent yard. He stood over the brute, breathing evenly, his expression serene. The brute lay there, winded, humiliated, his bravado utterly shattered. "Still think I'm just an old man, brute?" Elias's voice was quiet, yet it carried across the stunned yard. The brute, red-faced and panting, could only shake his head. The fight had been a masterclass, not of savagery, but of calculated efficiency. Elias hadn't simply won. He had dismantled. He hadn't just defeated the brute. He had discredited him. The message resonated through the yard, undeniable. This wasn't merely about protecting Flicker. It was about demonstrating a new kind of power, one that didn't rely on size or brute strength, but on intellect, strategy, and an unexpected, almost elegant precision. The brute's defeat was a symbolic turning point, a visible crack in the established hierarchy. Elias had just delivered the yard a new lesson in power dynamics, a glimpse of wisdom. The cell block's disquiet hung heavy, a palpable presence thick with unspoken questions, and the cloying sweetness of disinfectant battling a deeper reek of fear. Elias, braced against the common room's grimy wall, felt the warmth of a chipped ceramic mug seep into his palms. He observed the inmates, a tide of faces once defined by ingrained deference or raw aggression, now subtly shifting. The brute, his features a swollen testament to Elias's calculated blow, sat hunched in a corner, nursing a bruised ego and a throbbing jaw. No one dared approach him. Not a single eye met his. The established pecking order had been undeniably, brutally overturned. Flicker, still clutching his tattered book, sidled closer to Elias. "That guard, he didn't even glance at me today," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the fluorescent light's low hum. "Just walked right past, like I was invisible." Elias offered a faint smile. "They're seeing things differently, Flicker. We all are." He sipped his lukewarm coffee, its bitter edge a counterpoint to the quiet satisfaction blossoming within him. The guard's averted gaze was a small, resonant victory, a ripple from a larger disruption. It signified the warden's carefully constructed facade of order was not merely cracking, but splintering, exposing raw nerves beneath. Later that afternoon, a familiar shuffling announced Old Man Hemlock. He moved with a deliberate slowness, his gaze sweeping the altered landscape of the common room. He paused before Elias. His eyes, typically clouded with age, now held a sharp, discerning glint. "A bold move, young man," Hemlock rumbled, his voice gravelly yet clear. "To fell the oak, only to find the forest still stands." Elias met his gaze, intrigued. "And what wisdom does the forest hold, Hemlock?" The old man settled onto the bench opposite, his worn hands resting on his knees. "The forest holds myriad trees, Elias. Some tower, strong and ancient, others wither, weak and young. But all are intertwined by roots beneath the soil. You've pruned a rotten branch, yes, but the roots of this place run deep, deeper than you imagine." Flicker, captivated, moved closer, his book forgotten. Elias leaned forward, recognizing the gravity of Hemlock's words. "You speak of the warden's power?" Hemlock chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. The warden's power is a carefully cultivated illusion, boy. A theatrical performance. He thrives on the predictability of fear, the rhythmic cadence of submission. You've tossed a spanner into his clockwork. Yet a broken clock can still be mended or replaced. He paused, his gaze fixed on Elias. He will not brook chaos. He will demand order, and he will employ any means necessary to reinstate it. And that, Elias said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face, is precisely what will give him. He understood now. The warden wasn't a monster to be vanquished, but a system to be subverted. His rigid adherence to order was not a strength, but a glaring vulnerability. Order? Flicker interjected, a nervous tremor in his voice. But you just made everything chaotic. Elias turned to Flicker, a spark of mentorship in his eyes. Precisely. We've demonstrated their order is brittle. Now, we'll show them how to rebuild it, but this time, it will be an order of our design. One where negligence is brought to light, where vulnerability finds protection, and where true power resides not in brute force, but in collective awareness. He looked back at Hemlock, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The old man, for all his apparent frailty, possessed a profound understanding of the prison's intricate ecosystem. You have a plan, then, Hemlock stated, a hint of admiration in his voice. A framework, Elias corrected. The specifics will unfold as the warden reacts. His response is the next piece of the puzzle. He anticipates resistance, open rebellion. He expects us to confront him head-on. He leaned back, a subtle shift in his posture radiating quiet confidence. But we won't. We'll give him exactly what he needs, but on our terms. We'll expose the cracks not by smashing the wall, but by showing him how easily it can crumble from within. A new guard, one Elias hadn't seen before, strode past the common room, his eyes darting nervously, his hand unconsciously brushing the holster of his sidearm. He lingered momentarily, his gaze flitting from the brute in the corner to Elias, then hurried on. The air remained heavy, but the tension had subtly shifted. It was no longer the tension of impending violence, but of charged anticipation. Elias had not merely won a fight, he had sown the seed of an idea, an alternative future in the minds of the inmates, and in the warden's rigid world, an idea could be far more dangerous than any fist. Hemlock nodded slowly, a knowing smile playing on his lips. A wise gardener understands the soil, young man, and you, it seems, are beginning to understand the roots. Elias met his gaze, a quiet understanding passing between them. The game was far from over. In fact, it had just begun. The new quiet. The mess hall's usual din was muted, a strange, almost pious hush replacing the clang of trays. From his familiar perch, Elias observed the shift. The brute's reign had ended, ushering in a brittle calm. A surface tranquility stretched over churning anxieties. Inmates moved with a new wariness, eyes constantly assessing. They no longer saw isolated individuals. They perceived a nascent order, fragile yet undeniable, forming around Elias. Flicker, still jumpy despite Elias's protection, pecked at his food, his gaze glued to Elias. They're watching you, he breathed, his voice barely audible above the faint scrape of spoons. Elias nodded, deliberately chewing his unappetizing meal. Good. Let them. He grasped the evolving power dynamic. The void left by the brute was vast, and even within these walls, nature abhorred a vacuum. He was no longer just a fighter. He was a potential fulcrum, a benchmark against which others would measure themselves. This marked the crucial first step, forging a new kind of authority, one built on unexpected strength and strategic foresight, not mere muscle. Later that afternoon, during the brief hour of yard time, Elias found Old Man Hemlock tending his solitary patch of stubborn weeds near the perimeter fence. The old man's movements, slow and deliberate, belied a sharp awareness. "The air's different, isn't it, boy?" Hemlock rasped, his voice like rustling dry leaves, without looking up. "Quieter," Elias confirmed, leaning against the rough concrete. "But louder, too, in its own way." Hemlock finally met his gaze, a flicker of something ancient and knowing in his rheumy eyes. "Silence breeds plans, Elias. And fear, too." He yanked a particularly tenacious weed, its roots clinging stubbornly. "The warden thrives on controlled chaos. This new quiet, it rattles him. He senses a threat he can't quite pin down." Elias had already factored this in. The warden, a creature of rigid routines and predictable punishments, would undoubtedly be disoriented by an order he hadn't imposed. "He'll try to restore the old disorder," Elias predicted, "or invent a new one." "Precisely," Hemlock agreed. "And that's your opening. When he tries to reassert control, he'll expose the cracks in his own foundation. All you need to do is pry them open wider." Hemlock straightened, wincing slightly. "The system is a machine, Elias. Powerful, yes, but utterly dependent on its cogs turning as expected. Disrupt a few, and the whole thing grinds to a halt." The following days saw Elias subtly reinforcing his position. He issued no direct commands, yet his presence became a silent arbiter. A squabble over a dropped deck of cards dissipated with a mere glance. A tense exchange concerning a broken razor blade was resolved by a calm word. He wasn't playing the enforcer. He was simply present, observing, occasionally interceding with a quiet authority that surprised even himself. This understated assertion of influence rippled through the cell blocks, further solidifying his unlikely ascent. One evening, beneath the buzzing fluorescent lights, Elias initiated the next phase of his intricate design. He approached a small cluster near the back wall. Two fresh-faced inmates, barely out of their teens, and a nervous, wiry man known only as Sketch. "I need you to listen," Elias said, his voice low, pulling their focus. "And I need you to be smart." Sketch, ever opportunistic, narrowed his eyes. "What's the angle, Elias?" "No angle," Elias corrected. "Just observation. I want you to watch every shift change, every patrol route, every guard's idiosyncrasy, the kitchen, the infirmary, the laundry, anything out of the ordinary, anything that's routinely ordinary. I want to know when supplies arrive, when the trash is collected, everything." The younger inmates exchanged baffled glances, but Sketch's eyes, though still wary, held a spark of burgeoning interest. "What are we looking for?" "Weakness," Elias replied simply. "And opportunity." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. "The warden believes this place runs on fear. He believes he controls every single aspect. We're going to show him how tenuous that control truly is." He explained in hushed tones the concept of the butterfly effect, how a seemingly minor disruption, precisely placed, could cascade into unforeseen consequences. He spoke of negligence, of overlooked details, of the complacency that inevitably settled into any tightly controlled environment. The objective wasn't to incite a riot. It was to expose the system's inherent flaws, to engineer a disruption so profound, yet so subtly orchestrated, that the warden would be forced to acknowledge a power beyond his own. The air in the cell block felt charged. a subtle hum beneath the surface of the new quiet. Elias studied the faces of the men. He wasn't asking them to fight. He was asking them to think, to observe, to participate in a different kind of conflict. He was asking them to become aware, and as he saw the flicker of understanding, then resolve, in Sketch's eyes, he knew the seeds of his plan had been sown. The new quiet wasn't merely a lull, it was the calm before a very specific, very deliberate storm.